Last night, Jimmy Kimmel Live spiraled into chaos when a heated clash between Jimmy Kimmel and White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt erupted on air, leading to a jaw-dropping showdown that left Kimmel rattled, Leavitt defiant, and viewers stunned. Jimmy Kimmel is no stranger to confrontation, but nothing could have prepared his audience for the firestorm that erupted on last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live. From the moment Karoline Leavitt walked onto the stage, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kimmel, flashing his signature smirk, greeted her with a handshake that barely masked his underlying hostility. The crowd, sensing the unease, offered polite applause, but the atmosphere was palpably charged. From the outset, it was clear that Kimmel had an agenda. He wasted no time launching into pointed remarks about the Trump administration, lacing his questions with sarcasm and thinly veiled accusations. Karoline, poised and smiling professionally, answered each jab with a calm and measured tone, refusing to take the bait. The interview began with a simple enough question. So, Karoline, how does it feel to be the face of an administration that, let's be honest, has had a complicated relationship with the truth? There was a flicker of discomfort among the studio audience. It was unusually direct, even for Kimmel, but Karoline, maintaining her composure, responded smoothly. "It feels like a great honor," she said, her voice steady, "because I get to stand up for the American people who are tired of being lied to by the media, tired of being talked down to by late-night hosts who think they're smarter than everyone else." The audience let out a mixed reaction, half gasps, half applause. Kimmel chuckled tightly, sitting forward in his chair. "Oh, believe me," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nobody's lying like your boss did about, well, just about everything. The election, COVID, even his own marriage, for crying out loud." He paused, smiling as he twisted the knife. "Blink twice if Melania's okay." The studio erupted in awkward laughter, but Karoline did not miss a beat. Her eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "I think it's deeply inappropriate," she said crisply, "to mock someone's marriage from the comfort of a stage, especially when you're pretending to be a serious commentator and not just a glorified bully with a desk." Kimmel visibly stiffened, the smile dropping slightly from his face. The tension skyrocketed. "You want to talk about bullying?" he snapped. "How about bullying the American people with lies about a stolen election, about vaccines, about every shred of reality we have left?" The crowd was caught between awkward laughter and stunned silence. It was a full-blown confrontation now, with neither side backing down. Karoline leaned forward, her tone sharpening ever so slightly, though she never lost her calm. "The American people are smarter than you give them credit for, Jimmy. They know the difference between seeking the truth and manufacturing outrage for ratings. They can see through you." A sharp "ooh" rippled through the audience, followed by an uneasy murmur. Jimmy Kimmel, for the first time in recent memory, looked genuinely caught off guard. He opened his mouth to fire back, but hesitated just a second. "Too long." Karoline seized the moment. "People are tired," she said, her voice rising over the murmuring crowd. "They are tired of being called racists, insurrectionists, and traitors simply because they don't align with Hollywood's version of America. You don't represent the average American, Jimmy. You represent an out-of-touch elite who mocks the people you claim to care about." Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed tightly. His usual playful demeanor was gone, replaced with something more brittle and defensive. "You know what's funny?" he said finally, voice cold. "You sitting here, lecturing everyone about elites when you work for a billionaire who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire." The audience gasped, some even booed quietly. It was an unusually harsh moment, even by Kimmel's standards. Karoline remained unmoved. She gave a small smile, one that almost seemed to pity him. "Unlike you," she said, her voice almost gentle. "Now, I know where I stand. I stand with the millions of Americans you mock every night. You, Jimmy, stand with no one but yourself." Another murmur ran through the crowd, louder this time. Kimmel's face reddened. He shuffled his notes awkwardly, clearly trying to regain control of the segment. All right, he said tightly. Let's move on before we all drown in self-righteousness. But the damage was done. Karoline had scored a hit, and everyone in the room could feel it. The interview, intended to corner and embarrass her, had turned into a battlefield, and Karoline was winning. As Kimmel stumbled into his next question, grasping for a way to steer the conversation back on his terms, Karoline sat serenely, ready for whatever he threw next. Little did anyone know, the most explosive moments were still to come. So, Kimmel said, voice tightening as he rifled through his notes with exaggerated annoyance, you talk a big game about truth and the American people, but you work for a man who tried to overturn an election because he could not handle losing. Is that defending America, or just defending his ego? The crowd cheered loudly at the jab, grateful for a moment of familiar footing after the tense back and forth. But Karoline simply adjusted her posture and answered without hesitation. President Trump fought for election integrity, she said, her voice crisp and deliberate. Millions of Americans had legitimate concerns about how that election was conducted, and it is the duty of any leader to ensure the voice of the people is heard. Kimmel leaned in, pointing a finger at her now, his tone sharpening. Millions of Americans were lied to by people like you, Karoline. You peddled conspiracy theories that led to violence at the Capitol. You helped poison the well of democracy, and now you're here trying to lecture me about standing up for Americans? A few audience members clapped, but the room was tense again, heavier, like a storm about to break. Karoline smiled lightly, a stark contrast to Kimmel's growing agitation. The violence on January 6th was wrong, and I have always condemned it, she said evenly. But your side is perfectly happy to ignore violence when it fits your narrative. Cities burned for months during so-called peaceful protests, and you made jokes about it. Kimmel's mouth twitched. He tried to jump in, but Karoline kept going, her voice gaining strength. You sit here moralizing, pretending to be the conscience of America, but you only care about democracy when it goes your way. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Kimmel looked around, sensing he was losing the room again. His frustration boiled over. Do you even hear yourself? He said, voice rising. You're gaslighting everyone right here, live on national television. You want us to forget that your boss invited chaos, lied, and then hid behind people like you to clean up the mess? Karoline's response was devastating in its calmness. And you, she said softly but firmly, want to pretend you're brave for attacking people who cannot defend themselves from your platform. You attack Melania. You attack private citizens who voted for a president you do not like. That is not bravery, Jimmy. That is cowardice. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the usual background coughs and rustling died down. Kimmel's jaw tightened visibly. Okay, he said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. I guess it's opposite day. He threw his cards onto his desk theatrically, but the move felt desperate rather than funny. You want to talk about cowardice? Let's talk about an administration that hid behind lies, that locked children in cages. Those cages, Karoline interrupted smoothly, were built during the Obama administration. The same administration you never seem to criticize. Kimmel opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. The crowd, sensing the stumble, gave a few uncertain laughs. You know, he finally said, voice low and cutting, people like you are exactly why this country is so screwed up right now. Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward just enough that the cameras caught her expression perfectly. Serene, but deadly serious. People like me? She said. You mean people who refuse to let the media define them? People who think for themselves instead of parroting late-night propaganda? You mean Americans who still believe in freedom? There was a pause so long it almost became painful. Kimmel looked at his producers off camera for a split second, an unconscious, panicked glance. and when he turned back, the polished late-night host mask was slipping badly. "Freedom," he spat. "Freedom to believe whatever fantasy suits you. Freedom to deny reality. Freedom to hurt people." Karoline shook her head slightly, her face the picture of disappointment rather than anger. "Freedom," she said simply, "means the right to disagree with you without being silenced, mocked, or fired. Freedom means you do not have to live in fear because you voted differently than the people in Hollywood." Kimmel leaned across his desk now, abandoning all pretense of humor. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You know what it really means, Karoline? It means you get to sit here and pretend you're a hero while covering for a man who tried to stage a coup." The word hung in the air like smoke. The audience gasped audibly this time. Several people clapped nervously, but most just sat frozen. Karoline's response was ice cold. "And you," she said, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife, "get to sit here and pretend you're a serious voice in American culture, while hiding behind jokes because you are too afraid to have an honest debate." Kimmel slammed his hand on his desk, a loud, sharp thud that made several audience members jump. His face was beet red now. "All right," he snapped. "Enough of this." He turned to the audience, forcing a laugh that cracked under the strain. "Let's hear it for Karoline Leavitt, everybody. She'll be signing copies of her alternate reality out back." Some chuckled. Most didn't. It felt forced, hollow. Karoline stood slowly, her smile calm, almost maternal. "I'm happy to leave," she said, quietly, "if that's what you want. Because this, Jimmy, this is exactly what America is waking up to. They see the hatred. They see the double standards. They see the fear." Kimmel waved dismissively at her, trying to act nonchalant, but his body language screamed tension. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled papers on his desk. Yeah, he muttered. "Cue the martyrdom." Karoline turned to the audience, who, for the first time that night, seemed genuinely conflicted. "Remember," she said, her voice ringing clear as a bell, "the truth doesn't fear confrontation. Only lies do." With that, she gave a graceful nod and began to walk off stage, but not before Kimmel, unable to help himself, muttered into his microphone, "Good riddance." The comment, meant to be offhand, came across bitter, petty, and above all, weak. The cameras captured the moment perfectly. Karoline, walking calmly off stage, head held high, while Kimmel sat fuming at his desk, trapped under the weight of a confrontation he had started but spectacularly failed to control. And just like that, the confrontation went viral, exploding across social media within minutes. Hashtags began to trend. Clips circulated like wildfire. But the chaos was only just beginning. By the time the late-night credits finished rolling, the internet was ablaze. Within an hour, our Karoline Leavitt, our Kimmel meltdown, and Jimmy kicked off were all trending across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Commentators across the political spectrum chimed in, with some praising Karoline for her composure under fire and others condemning Kimmel's aggressive tactics. Conservative voices hailed Karoline as a hero, a modern-day David facing down the Goliath of Hollywood. Even moderate viewers, who usually stayed out of political fights, commented that Kimmel's behavior felt uncomfortable, mean-spirited, and above all, desperate. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel's loyal defenders rushed to his side, arguing that Karoline was gaslighting the audience and deserved the tough questioning. But their arguments seemed strained, outnumbered by countless clips replaying the most damning moments. Jimmy's red face, his hand slamming the desk, his bitter muttering as Karoline walked off stage without so much as raising her voice. It was a public relations disaster for Kimmel. Producers at ABC scrambled behind the scenes. They had intended for a sharp, viral moment, yes, but not this. Not a clip that showed Jimmy, one of their crown jewels, humiliated on his own turf. Executives flooded Kimmel's team with emails before sunrise, demanding emergency meetings, damage control strategies, and maybe, if necessary, an on-air apology. But Kimmel was in no mood for apologies. The next morning, Jimmy logged onto social media for the first time since the incident. His heart sank as he scrolled through brutal memes and endless clips of himself looking petty and shaken. Some posts compared Karoline's performance to a masterclass in calm under pressure. Others were less forgiving toward Kimmel. Screenshots of his flushed face side by side with headlines calling it a late-night meltdown. The humiliation was complete. And worse, it was growing. By noon, daytime news shows were already booking political commentators to discuss what they were calling the Kimmel disaster. Clips of Karoline walking confidently off the stage while Jimmy fumed had now been viewed tens of millions of times. In one particularly brutal segment, a CNN anchor remarked dryly, "Late-night hosts used to roast politicians. Last night one got roasted by a politician, and she never even raised her voice." Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. She appeared that same morning on several conservative talk shows, where she was welcomed like a conquering hero. On one radio program, the host asked her directly, "Karoline, you were calm while he was basically losing it. How did you keep your cool?" Karoline, ever poised, replied, "I went there knowing what to expect. Jimmy Kimmel does not represent America, and he does not represent the truth. My job is to speak for the people who feel voiceless. If that makes a certain elites uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine." The quote spread instantly. Another wave of support flooded her pages. By late afternoon, the backlash reached a critical point when even celebrities, actors, comedians, influencers, started weighing in. Some defended Kimmel, calling him brave for standing up to Trump allies. But many more, including neutral entertainers who usually avoided politics altogether, said plainly that he had come off as mean, cornered, and wildly unprofessional. Few dared to say what had been obvious to everyone watching: Karoline had won. Back at ABC's studios, the atmosphere was frantic. Producers debated canceling that night's live show altogether. They knew Jimmy would want to address the controversy, but they were terrified he would only make it worse if he came out swinging again. In closed-door meetings, Kimmel's team urged him to stay calm, to strike a humble tone, to maybe even laugh about it and move on. Jimmy nodded through the advice sessions, but inside, rage was building. He had spent 2 decades crafting a persona that was equal parts likable and edgy. He was the everyman who punched up, not down. But last night, he had lost control. He had punched down, and everyone saw it. Worse still, he had been beaten at his own game, live, with no way to edit it out. By evening, Jimmy sat alone in his office, staring at the viral clips playing over and over on his phone. In one clip, Karoline's voice rang out clearly. "The truth doesn't fear confrontation. Only lies do." He threw his phone onto the couch with a loud clatter, cursing under his breath. He could not just laugh this off. He could not pretend it had not happened. And every fiber of his pride told him he could not, under any circumstances, apologize. But the network was pressuring him. The ratings hit from last night was undeniable. Viewers were tuning in, yes, but for all the wrong reasons. Sponsors were already starting to whisper about pulling ads if the controversy got any worse. Jimmy knew he had to address it on air. He had to come up with something, anything, something that would humiliate Karoline the way she had humiliated him. The thought festered as he sat, brooding. He imagined playing her walk-off clip back on his show tonight, mocking her, maybe even editing it to make her look ridiculous. Maybe he could turn the tables. Maybe he could still win. But deep down, he knew. The more he fought this, the worse he would look. And as showtime approached, Jimmy Kimmel, usually brimming with bravado and quick wit, sat paralyzed with indecision. Would he double down on the fight and risk total implosion? Or would he swallow his pride, laugh off his defeat, and try to salvage what little dignity he had left? As the clock ticked closer to airtime, Tensions backstage reached a fever pitch. America waited, popcorn in hand, to see if Jimmy Kimmel would survive the biggest public humiliation of his career, or dig himself in even deeper. The opening monologue started. The band played as usual. Jimmy Kimmel walked out to his usual spot at center stage, but there was no denying it. Something was different. His walk lacked its usual bounce. His smile strained. The audience, sensing the tension, clapped, politely but without the usual enthusiasm. He stood there gripping the microphone, looking out over the crowd. He chuckled awkwardly into the mic. "Well, it's been a fun 24 hours, he said, forcing a grin. A few scattered laughs. Mostly silence. Jimmy shuffled his cards, looked up, and then tossed them aside dramatically. "Let's just talk about it," he said, sighing. "You all saw what happened. I had Karoline Leavitt on this show last night, and things got a little heated." Another ripple of uncomfortable laughter. He paced slightly, the cameras tracking his every move. "Look," he said, "I get passionate about this stuff. I care about the truth, about democracy, and sometimes I get a little animated." He was trying to sound self-deprecating. It wasn't landing. The audience waited for the punchline that never came. Instead, Jimmy's face darkened slightly. And if defending the truth means calling out lies, even if it makes some people uncomfortable, then "That's what I'm going to keep doing," he said, his voice sharpening. "I'm not going to apologize for standing up against misinformation." There was a smattering of applause, mostly half-hearted. Jimmy nodded, feeding off what little energy he could salvage. "Now, some people are mad because I got a little emotional. They say I lost it. Maybe I did. But I would rather lose my temper fighting for what's right than sit there and polish lies with a smile." There it was, his attempt to reframe the narrative, to paint Karoline's calmness not as strength but as deceit. The audience clapped a little louder this time. Some stood, but it still felt hollow. And then, without warning, Jimmy Kimmel pivoted. "Hard. You know," he said, chuckling darkly, "it's funny. People act like just because someone stays calm, they're telling the truth. Let me tell you something. Con men are calm. Cult leaders are calm. That doesn't make them right." The audience cheered louder now, sensing Jimmy was clawing back some ground. "But I'll tell you what," he continued, a glint of bitterness flashing across his face. "Next time I'll just sit back, smile, and let people spin their fantasy about rigged elections and Hollywood elites without interrupting. Maybe then Twitter won't have a meltdown." Laughter, but again, uneasy. Jimmy wrapped up the monologue without directly mentioning Karoline again, moving briskly onto his next segment. But anyone paying attention could see it. This wasn't the triumphant comeback Jimmy's team had hoped for. It was damage control, at best. And outside the studio, the reaction was swift. Social media exploded again. Only this time, it wasn't outrage. It was mockery. Clips of Jimmy's half-hearted defense were posted side by side with Karoline's calm dismantling from the night before. Memes exploded. Jimmy's attempt to flip the narrative only reignited the firestorm he was desperate to escape. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt only rose higher. The very next day, she appeared on a major morning news show, sitting across from a sympathetic host who opened the interview with, "America saw you stay calm under fire. How did you do it?" Karoline, ever composed, simply smiled. "I didn't go there to fight Jimmy Kimmel," she said. "I went there to speak the truth. I went there to show that you can disagree passionately without losing your dignity. And when people see that, they know who's really standing for them." It was a masterclass. Her words were clipped into TikToks, Instagram Reels, and YouTube videos that racked up tens of millions of views in hours. Commentators across the spectrum admitted, whether they agreed with her politics or not, she had completely outclassed Jimmy Kimmel. The fallout at ABC was swift but quiet. Behind the scenes, executives ordered Kimmel's team to tone down the political attacks for the foreseeable future. Sponsors demanded assurances that the show would not spiral into another viral disaster. Jimmy, chastened but defiant, nodded along to the demands, but something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel looked vulnerable, beatable, and Karoline Leavitt, barely in her 30s, had been the one to do it. The final blow came later that week, when a national poll was released. It asked viewers whether they believed Jimmy Kimmel had handled the interview with Karoline Leavitt fairly. The results were brutal. 2% said no, only 18% said yes. News outlets reported on it gleefully, spinning headlines like Kimmel's fall from grace and Leavitt leaves Kimmel shaken, America stunned. In the days that followed, Karoline's star continued to rise. She was booked for speaking engagements, interviews, and even floated as a future political candidate. Whether or not she pursued that path, one thing was certain. She had turned a late-night ambush into a national moment of triumph. And Jimmy Kimmel, once the unchallenged king of confrontation, had been dethroned not by a fellow comedian, not by a celebrity scandal, but by a young woman armed only with a microphone, the truth, and an unshakable calmness that had exposed everything. In the end, the confrontation wasn't just a viral moment, it was a turning point, a reminder to America that sometimes, real strength is not about shouting the loudest, but about standing your ground when the world expects you to crumble. Jimmy Kimmel would continue hosting. Karoline Leavitt would continue speaking, but neither of them, or their audiences, would ever forget the night the tables turned, and Hollywood got a glimpse of just how powerful real conviction could be.